Thanks, Jason. Morning, everyone. Before I start, I just want to thank LiveCor for inviting Mecardo to present today, and also I'd extend that thanks to ARLEC and MLA for involving Mecardo in using the data. I guess that's what we're known for, using the data to show the benefit of the live trade industry to Australia. We produced a couple of reports, one on the cattle market, which is that one you can find on the LiveCor and Mecardo websites, also copies in the trade stand, and then that was November of last year, and then this year we released one on the live sheep trade, September of this year. So I'm going to just focus on parts of these two reports, but certainly if you want some more information, come and see me or grab a copy of those reports online or down at the trade stand there. There we go. All right, so I'll just start at having a look at the beef industry initially, and this graphic demonstrates the proportional flow of the beef sector. This is averages across the 2012 to 2017 period, so it's 5-year average proportional flows. And what I want to focus your attention on, and it goes to the point that Tim was showing as well with regards to the importance of the live trade sector when you're comparing live trade to domestic processing. The centre part of those two, the diagrams in the brackets there, where you look at the proportion. Now that's proportion of live cattle that exit the port in those states. So it's not necessarily where they've domiciled or where they started their life. Certainly there's some in northwest Australia that make their way out of Darwin, so they're included in those numbers. But we can see, just comparing the top of that bracketed area, looking at the live trade in particular for the Northern Territory, Queensland and WA, those figures, and contrast them to the bracket below, which shows the domestic and processed box product. And you can see that particularly for the Northern Territory for live cattle, 38% going out as live, but the Northern Territory processing falls down to that other states category of 8%. And I think what Tim showed there as well, particularly during these dry seasons where the live export space really allows producers to turn off stock into markets that are otherwise not as available with regards to processing. If we move forward and have a look at the similar diagram for the live force for the sheep industry. So this one's from the most recent report and looks at averages from 2014 through to 2018 period. Again, a similar scenario, just drawing your attention to those brackets in the centre. Obviously, no surprise to those involved in the live sheep trade that WA is a massive market with regards to live sheep, with 82% of Australian sheep going out of that port in Fremantle predominantly. But again, if you contrast those big numbers there in WA to the processing side in WA, you can see the 13% of domestic processing. So again, a real important aspect for the producer with regards to their turn-off. And again, it should come to no surprise to those involved in the sector there that over the last 5 years or so, the average turn-off for WA producers that go to the live trades around 30%. So a significant market for them. If we just focus in on part of these reports, and I'm going to look at employment, I'm going to look at some value chain analysis, and also the reliance on the trade in terms of revenue streams. But we'll start off with employment for cattle. So what we did at Mecardo is took some data from ABARES on their annual farm survey, their AGIS survey, and that enabled us to get a measure of what we call the on-farm employment numbers. So these are full-time equivalent hours. And what we're really looking at there is determining the amount of employment that actually is LIVEX related. So if you can imagine a farm that says, say in terms of their annual sales proportions, if they've got 50% of their sales that go to LIVEX in a given year and they employ 4 staff as a full-time equivalent hours, that would account for 2 people effectively is how those numbers are represented. And then we've used a multiplier effect to gross out that figure to encompass other participants within the live cattle trade, and that's where we get the total employment number. So if you think of somewhere like say a transport company that has reported 25% or so of their revenues are LIVEX or related, and they've got, say, 10 full-time staff, then you're talking 2.5 as an equivalent that would go into that total figure. And what we're trying to capture with that total number is across the whole of the participants in the value chain. When you're looking at those multipliers, we don't extend it. So say if there's a transport company, they're part of the trade, and the proportion of their revenue we put into the numbers when we're calculating those full-time equivalent hours, but then they would obviously have fuel suppliers, tyre suppliers and mechanics that they'd be employing as part of their general business. The multiplier doesn't take into account those additional services that are not necessarily directly related to the aspect of the live cattle trade as a value chain analysis. So to have a look at a couple, and we have got within that document I showed you before, we have got a variety of value chain analysis across a couple of different states, but I thought I'd focus in, for the purpose of this presentation, on the Northern Territory, given that it's the biggest market, and I've added Queensland as well, just because we're here in beautiful, humid Townsville. I struggle, boy from Ballarat. If you see me melting at some stage later in the afternoon, you can throw a cold beer on me and it should revive me. So I focused in on those two in terms of the live cattle analysis. So we're looking at the proportional flows, and what really springs to mind straight away is the amount of the value chain that goes to producers, nearly 57% for both of the states from the surveying Mecardo has done. And then again, it shows that importance that the live trade, certainly for cattle, is for returns back to the farm gate. If you look at it across a national average, a value chain, it's something like 52% is returned back to the farmer. And when you're looking at those numbers this was from that 2012 to 2017 period, during that time, I think the average revenue was about 1.2 billion in total that the live cattle trade was delivering, and so that equates, 52%, that equates for the nation about $620 million that goes to the farm gate as part of that trade. Obviously that's a bit higher now with some of the bigger numbers we've seen more recently. What I want to draw your attention to, though, just before I switch to the next slide in this value chain, I'm going to focus in on transport operators and on vets for the Northern Territory market. I'm going to have a look at transport operators for Queensland. So you can see for transport in the Northern Territory, 2.2% is a fairly small cut of that value chain. So, they're clipping the ticket, but they're only taking a small percent, and the vets are taking even smaller at 0.4%. On the Queensland side, you're looking at 1.5 for transport. If we look at the next analysis we did at Mecardo, that shows the reliance on revenue. So this is querying those members or those participants within the supply chain and asking them, well, okay, they take a small cut, like I said, the transport guys at 2.5% in Northern Territory, but how much of their actual revenue stream in their business model is live export related? And you can see for transport companies, it's, they reported between 50 to 75% of their actual revenue. So even though it's a small cut of that small clip of the ticket, it's a significant amount of their business revenue, and that has implications for their business should the trade diminish or go through moratoriums like we've seen in the live sheep space. Again, if we look at the veterinarians in the Northern Territory, 0.4% of the value of the chain, but between 75 to 100% of their income stream is reported as being earned through the live cattle trade. So they're really important sectors, not just for the producer, but also for other members across the whole of the value chain. If we take a look at Queensland, which I think was 1.4% for transport companies as part of the proportion of the value chain, but again, between 25 to 50% in transport companies in Queensland reporting that their revenue was live cattle export related. We'll switch across to the most recent analysis now on the sheep trade and looking at employment figures. So again, a similar methodology. We looked at the ABARES AAGIS data to derive an on-farm live export related full-time employment number of just over 1,000 workers, and then extrapolate that up to using a multiplier to find the total number of employment within the sector, again through members of that value chain. So you might say a shearing team that has a team of 10, and if 20% of their revenue, so you're looking at 2 staff members that would go into that overall figure. However, we're not capturing again those additional support services such as say a rural merchandise store that the shearers are accessing goods in, or indeed a grocery store or something that they might be feeding their shearing team with. We're not extending the multiplier to those areas, but certainly as part of phase 2 of our report, we're working with LiveCore. We are looking at those areas, and I'm going to delve on that at the end of the presentation, just to show you some of the stories we're finding from our consultation, extending it outside the value chain and into the impact across the community. So if we look at the value chain for West Australia, again being the biggest one for live sheep, I've focused in on that. And we can see that just over 44%. So a similar scenario to the live cattle situation, that a large proportion gets returned back to the producer. If we put the West Australian and the South East Australian states, if we put them together as a national figure, that proportion to the producers is at around 45%. And if we're looking at the average numbers, I think the figure was 220 million in terms of total revenue for the trade over the last 5 years, from 2013 through to 18. That 45% would represent around $100 million back to the farm gate. Of course, there's other members in the chain, just like with live cattle. I'm going to focus in on them in a minute. So looking again at the transport at 1.4%, the shearing teams at 2.8% of the value chain. I'm going to include fodder suppliers as well when we go to the next slide, and at 12.8%, which is a bigger proportion, but it's an interesting one when it comes to the live sheep trade, certainly for West Australia. So if we take a look at that revenue reliance diagram again, we can see for say the fodder manufacturer, it's up around that 75 to 100% of their revenue reliance, that pallet manufacturer supplying into the live sheep trade. So significant numbers that, both 12%, 12.8% was their proportion of the value chain, but also very big numbers of revenue reliance going through for the pallet manufacturers there in the West. Similarly for transport operators, you had a small proportion of the value chain, but between 25 to 50% of revenue reliance, and equally the shearing team, so that includes your wool classer as well, and other people as part of that shearing team. You're looking at somewhere between 5 to 25% of their revenue reliance is specifically live export sheep related. So I'm just going to use what we're doing here, and I know this is a bit of a messy diagram. It'll probably give you a bit of a headache this time in the morning. Don't get too bogged down with the complexity. What it's showing there, that the size of those bubbles represents the size of the reliance that they have, they've reported in terms of the live sheep export trade. But if I draw your attention to something like, and this is delving on some of the case study stories we're starting to look at for phase 2 of our report for LiveCore, and focusing in on the moratorium period we saw this year and the suspension to the trade we saw last year for live sheep. So if you look at something like a transport operator, I can think of a couple of case studies we've looked at without divulging the name of the operator, but there was a medium-sized transport company in WA. They reported 25% of their revenues were live export sheep related, employing around 20 full-time staff. And as an impact to them that flows through to the rest of the community, they reported that that they've seen a drop in their livestock related side of their business due to the moratorium that impacted revenue. But what was important to them was that this particular company had a stock crate that they had on order, $400,000 stock crate that was on order, that they cancelled, and that obviously had implications. You can see the line from the transport operator to the engineer fabricator. So that's a member of a regional community that's just lost a $400,000 order because of the insecurity around the sector, and the cost of that moratorium is starting to leach into the rest of the community. That also has implications for things like the local mechanic and the tyre manufacturer of the fuel services. This particular operator, that's a medium-sized transport company, had said that in the last few years, on the back of the moratorium periods, they've seen a decline in services on offer at the local town. And so where they were spending previously, they were spending around $1.5 million a year in the local town with the local mechanics and the tyre depot. Because of the reduced services that's now being on offer, they have to spend that now back in Perth. So it just means money out of that regional sector, and that has implications then for the broader regional community when you apply this moratorium. If we move to shearing teams, we spoke to quite a few shearing teams, and there was two in particular that come to mind in Katanning and also in Lake Grace. And between the two of them, they operate, while the Katanning one operates three teams of about 10 men, would be the normal time, and the Lake Grace one was 7 teams, again of around 10 men during normal time. So a total about 100 people that get work. Now, the impact of the moratorium that they'd both said that was there was pretty much a reduction in that period of time of a third, down to a third of their staff, so going from 7 teams down to 3 in one instance, and going down from 3 teams to 1. And that's just because traditionally in WA during that time where the moratorium's on, it's a quiet time for shearing, so it's really the live sheep shearing that gets done through that period that sustains those workers. So for that period of time, there was staff there that, from going from 100 staff, I guess, in total down to 40. So you've got 60 staff that are there no longer earning an income for those 3 to 4 months during that moratorium. And that has implications, of course, for the local community. We've got, on that particular diagram, if you see shearing services just to the, I'll see if I can pick it up on there. So shearing services, and then you've got the grocer. We've added the grocer in this instance. Now that, when we're thinking about the employment numbers, obviously the grocer doesn't get included in those overall employment numbers, but one of the shearing team managers told me that when they are actually shearing in a town with those teams and got the 10 men and the multiple teams, he said the average supply bill for their food for that team that they have for the time they're in the town, it can work out to about $12,000 a month that's being spent at the local IGA. Now during the moratorium, that's just not getting spent. So it's not just the staff wages that are not being earned, but it's also the money that's not being spent in town. And if you think back to the shearing team in Katanning that I told you about, so the 3 shearing teams down to 1, that drop in income for those workers equates to around $350,000 worth of non-earned income for those members during the stage of the moratorium. So again, money not being spent in the local community, which has implications all around. One last story that I'll just tell you, which is in relation to sheep buyers and vets on ships. So some of these guys are contracted by the exporters, and obviously by the nature of their job, 100% of their revenue is reliant upon the trade. And a couple of AAV vets that we'd spoke to and sheep buyers we've spoken to that said that during those suspension and moratorium time, you're talking of effectively no income at all for those guys, for almost up to a 4-month period, 2 parts of the year. So it has significant impacts, this moratorium across the whole supply chain. And part of what we're going to release at Mecardo in the next coming weeks or a month or so is stage 2 of our report, which delves into some of these case studies across the supply chain, just to understand exactly how important the trade is to all members of the supply chain. I think I'm nearly done. I'll just go to the last slide there. So there's a few details on us and a little plug from Mecardo if you haven't heard about us already. We do run a commodity conversations on podcast that you can jump on and have a listen to if you want to hear my boring old tones, or indeed the Scottish tones of one of my colleagues, Andrew Whitelaw. But people seem to love to hear him. But I might flick to questions now and see if you've got anything you want to ask. Thank you.
I'd just like to ask a question about the future demand that might be possible. Should the drought break and cattle and the inevitable, I guess, female value goes skyrocketing to rebuild the herd, what's the potential value of those animals in those couple of years with the ASF and that likely demand? How far could it go?
I can field this one if you want, or unless Tim wants to. Is Tim still here somewhere? Yeah, thanks, mate. We do actually, at Mecardo, we do have some modelling that takes into account a whole range of factors looking at annual average prices. We have done some modelling to show what the impact would be on a break to the drought. Certainly, if you, and two of the models we run, one's a Eastern Cattle Indicator model, Eastern States Cattle Indicator model, that we're looking at young cattle prices. And so, as an average price, I think if you think back to when we saw the the drought breaking in that 14-15 period, and then we got that real big restocker activity. I think the average price is up above 600 cents a kilo carcass weight for the Eckie, and I think it peaked at about 725 that season. Looking at current situation with where the herd's sitting and factoring in some of that additional demand out of China, we're looking at a break of the drought and young cattle prices going higher than that period of 16-17 as an annual average. I think the level was something like 680 cents a kilo carcass weight as an annual average, which would push it through the season up higher than that and possibly into the 800 cent level as a potential for young cattle. Similarly with heavy steer prices, we've already seen this year, and the model shows this year that with the tight supply we're seeing in the herd, it's kept those heavy steer prices quite high, even though we're seeing significant slaughter due to the drought. The heavy steer modelling shows a similar scenario, not quite as extreme as for young cattle, but it still shows annual average prices going into above $6 once the drought breaks for heavy steers too for the next few seasons.
Matt, Dan Lynch from a producer. I'm just wondering, because of your obviously vested interest with the pig industry, your predictions is when, or is it if, African swine flu will get to Australia? And if so, the perception, because it's a protein like beef is, will it have an effect on, the consumption of beef, not only domestically but maybe worldwide, because of it being a protein?
So it's a good question. There's a couple of things in there, I guess, to address. Certainly, I think from a perspective of whether ASF has reached Australia, we're already aware that it actually has reached the border at the ports and at the airports. Certainly, it just hasn't gone out into the broader community, which is the main thing really that we're focusing on. I think from a production perspective within Australia, there's a similarity, I guess you could compare to Western Europe model. The pig production methods within Australia are much more like you see in those countries like Denmark that have that Western model, very different to Southeast Asia and other parts of Eastern Europe where a lot more smaller producers that have potentially less biosecurity factors in place than some of the larger operations. So I think if it got into the country in Australia, it wouldn't be a great thing for the fact that we no longer can say we're ASF free, but from a production perspective, it's probably going to be limited in its damage to the commercial farms just because of the nature of how they do take biosecurity very seriously. I think the bigger concern from the pork industry would be around the free-range pork sector. It would be difficult to probably keep it out of those particular farms just by the nature of that production model. From the perspective, I guess, of someone that's involved in the pork industry, obviously we'd rather keep it out totally because I think it does have some benefits to Australia, not so much immediately because we don't really export a lot of pork from Australia as fresh product. But certainly it's a bit like the FMD scenario for beef. If we can maintain a free status in terms of ASF, the potential for growth in that sector I think is immense, and then the potential to add a premium to a pork product from Australia that's ASF free would be similar to the type of approach we have for beef. In terms of switching of domestic production, I think that it's probably more, I think we're already seeing a trend that a move away, in some instances, away from beef towards things like pork and chicken, but I think that's partially a price point rather than anything to do with any concerns around a virus or implications for production.